The man who lost everything. Samuel Johnson had always prided himself on being a man of principles and determination. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, he had lived a life that was simple yet fulfilling. His hands had built homes and bridges, strong and skillful from years of working as a carpenter. At 52, his life had been nothing remarkable to the outside world, but to him, it had been perfect. A loving wife, Marie, two beautiful children, Tyrone and Aisha, and a house that he had proudly constructed with his own hands. It was everything he ever wanted, and he worked hard every day to keep it all together. But that was before the night that shattered his world into a million unrecognizable pieces. The memory of that night haunted him, surfacing in waves of grief that never seemed to ease. It had been a regular evening, the kind Samuel never thought would stand out in his mind. Until the phone call. It was supposed to be a peaceful night at home. Marie had been preparing dinner, Tyrone was busy with his homework, and Aisha was excitedly chatting about her upcoming school play. Samuel had been at the construction site, working overtime to ensure a job was completed by the end of the week. He had been tired, bone-tired, but happy. His family was waiting for him, and that's all that mattered. But as he pulled into the driveway, just moments from stepping inside his warm, welcoming home, his phone rang. Marie's voice on the other end was frantic, breaking, barely holding together as she told him about the accident. "There's been a crash, Tyrone. Aisha, they're hurt. You need to come now." His heart stopped, the world turning on its head. He had driven as fast as he could to the hospital, his mind racing with prayers and fear, clutching the steering wheel as if it were the last solid thing he could hold on to. But by the time he arrived, it was too late. His children, his joy, his future, they were gone. A drunk driver had sped through a red light and smashed into their car with lethal force. His wife had been the one who survived the longest, long enough to whisper her last words, asking for forgiveness, that she couldn't protect their children. The weeks after were a blur of unbearable pain. Samuel barely ate or slept. He just existed. He felt like a shadow of the man he once was, hollowed out by grief. Work became an escape at first, a way to forget, to distract himself. But eventually, even that fell apart. His back, once strong and dependable, gave out under the stress and physical toll. Samuel found himself without a job, without an income, and without the will to keep moving forward. Then came the eviction notices. He had no savings left, no family to fall back on. He spiraled into depression and turned to alcohol to numb the never-ending ache inside. Before long, he lost the house that had once echoed with the laughter of his children. He was cast out into the streets, stripped of everything that had made his life meaningful. Now, years later, Samuel found himself waking up each morning beneath the towering shadows of the city's skyscrapers, his body stiff and cold from sleeping on the hard pavement. His tent, a makeshift home assembled from tattered tarps and broken-down cardboard, was nestled in a forgotten corner of the city where the authorities rarely bothered to patrol. As dawn broke over the city, Samuel stirred. His breath was visible in the early morning chill, and he instinctively pulled his worn-out blanket tighter around him. He emerged from his tent with the same wariness that had become a part of him, his salt and pepper beard tangled and unkempt, his dark skin weathered by the elements. His once proud shoulders were now hunched, burdened by the weight of years of hardship. He hadn't seen himself in a mirror for months, maybe even years. What was the point? The man he had been no longer existed. As Samuel began his daily ritual of gathering his few possessions, a tin cup, a worn notebook, a couple of old photos of his family, his mind wandered back to better days. He could almost hear Marie humming in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes as she prepared their Sunday breakfasts. He could still see Tyrone chasing Aisha around the backyard, their laughter filling the air with joy. These memories, once so full of love and warmth, now felt like cruel taunts, reminding him of everything he had lost. Marie, Tyrone, Aisha, he whispered, their names catching in his throat like a prayer he no longer believed in. He finished packing and began his walk towards his usual spot, a busy intersection in the heart of the city. Samuel had learned to time his begging to the morning rush hour, when people were hurrying to work, still half asleep, and perhaps more likely to drop a coin in his cup out of guilt or pity. His cardboard sign, worn and faded, read the same words it had for years: homeless and hungry. Anything helps. God bless. The words felt hollow, much like his own existence. The pedestrians moved past him in a blur of indifference, their eyes averted, pretending he didn't exist. Occasionally, someone would drop a coin into his cup, but most just hurried by. Samuel had become invisible, another part of the city's neglected landscape, a living reminder of the cruelty of fate. By noon, his cup was nearly empty, and his stomach rumbled with hunger. But Samuel had grown used to this. The hunger, the cold, the loneliness, they were old companions now, woven into the fabric of his existence. He sat back against the cold brick wall, pulling his jacket tighter around him, trying to ignore the biting wind that whipped through the streets. It was then that he heard it, a soft whimper, almost imperceptible amidst the noise of the city. Samuel looked around, searching for the source of the sound. His eyes fell on a nearby alley, shadowed and dim, a place most people wouldn't bother to glance at. Something stirred in the darkness, a slight movement that caught Samuel's attention. Curiosity piqued, Samuel slowly rose to his feet and shuffled towards the alley. As he stepped into the shadows, his eyes adjusted, revealing a shape huddled near a pile of trash. It was a dog, skinny, filthy, and barely clinging to life. The dog looked up at him with eyes that mirrored his own, desperate, broken, but still somehow filled with a flicker of hope. It was as if the animal recognized in Samuel a kindred spirit, both of them lost and forgotten by the world. "Hey there, little fella," Samuel said, his voice rough from disuse. He crouched down slowly, extending a hand towards the dog, unsure if it would bolt or bite. But the dog didn't move. It simply lay there, too weak to do much of anything. Its ribs were visible through its dirty, matted fur, and one of its legs was twisted at an odd angle, likely broken and never healed. Without thinking, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the remains of a sandwich he had been saving for later. He tore off a piece and held it out to the dog. For a moment, the animal hesitated, but hunger won out, and it slowly, cautiously, crawled forward to take the food from Samuel's hand. As the dog ate, Samuel watched it with a sense of quiet understanding. He knew what it was like to be starving, to be in pain, to feel abandoned. And for the first time in years, Samuel felt something stir in his chest, a faint, almost forgotten feeling of connection. When the dog had finished, it looked up at him again, those soulful eyes piercing through the fog of Samuel's despair. "Well," Samuel said softly, "I guess we're both strays now, huh?" He reached out to pet the dog, and to his surprise, it leaned into his touch, its tail wagging weakly. For the first time in a long time, Samuel smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but a smile nonetheless. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And so, the unlikely pair sat there in the shadows, two forgotten souls finding solace in each other's presence as the world rushed by, oblivious to their quiet bond. Little did Samuel know, this chance encounter would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. This is just the beginning of Samuel's journey. In the next parts, their bond will deepen, leading to a chain of events that will not only restore Samuel's hope, but also offer him a path to redemption and unexpected fortune. Shadows of the past. Samuel woke to the soft rustle of movement beside him. His eyes fluttered open to find Shadow already awake, sitting by the entrance of the tent with his nose twitching as he sniffed the morning air. The dog's keen senses had grown sharper with each passing day, a reflection of both his physical recovery and the growing bond between man and animal. Samuel sat up slowly, his joints protesting the motion, and stretched his stiff limbs, feeling the coldness of the ground deep in his bones. He glanced at Shadow, who turned his head and gave a soft bark, as if urging him to get moving. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Samuel's mouth. He couldn't help but marvel at the changes in both of them since the day they met. Shadow, who once seemed so fragile and broken, now carried a new vitality, and Samuel, despite the gnawing hunger and uncertainty of each day, felt more alive than he had in years. Today, though, there was something different in the air. An unease crept into Samuel's mind as he packed up their few belongings. The city seemed quieter, as if the usual morning hustle had slowed down, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Samuel couldn't quite place it, but his instincts, honed over years of navigating the streets, warned him to be extra cautious. As they set off, Samuel couldn't shake the nagging sense that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder several times, but the streets appeared empty save for the usual early risers, other homeless individuals, the occasional dog walker, and a few delivery trucks making their rounds. Shadow padded alongside him, his limp barely noticeable now, but his ears twitched every now and then, as if he too sensed something unusual. They made their way to their usual scavenging spot, the alley behind a bakery that often discarded day-old bread and pastries. The smell of freshly baked goods hung in the air, taunting Samuel's empty stomach. He crouched near the dumpster, rifling through the bags in search of something still edible. Shadow sat patiently beside him, his tail wagging slowly, knowing the routine. "Here we go, boy," Samuel said, pulling out a loaf of slightly stale bread. He tore off a piece and handed it to Shadow, who took it gently from his hand, munching contentedly. As they ate in silence, Samuel's mind wandered back to the past. Memories of his old life surfaced unbidden, bringing with them a familiar ache. He remembered waking up to the smell of Marie's cooking, her laughter filling their small but cozy kitchen. The kids would come running down the stairs, their faces alight with excitement, eager to start the day. Those mornings had been so ordinary, so routine, and yet now they felt like precious jewels, memories he clung to as if they were the last remnants of a life that had slipped through his fingers. It had been 5 years since the accident. 5 long, bitter years of grief, regret, and survival. The weight of those years pressed down on Samuel like a heavy cloak, suffocating in its despair. He had lost everything in one terrible night. His family, his home, his job. He had tried to rebuild, to start over, but the pain had been too great. And then came the back injury, the job loss, and the slow, inevitable slide into homelessness. He had thought about ending it more times than he cared to admit. But something had always stopped him, a flicker of hope, a whisper of his family's voices in his mind, urging him to keep going, to live for them. And now, there was Shadow. The dog had given him a reason to wake up, a reason to fight, even if it was just for another day. Samuel sighed, standing up and dusting off his hands. "Come on, boy," he said to Shadow, who finished the last of his bread and looked up expectantly. "Let's see what else we can find." They wandered the streets for hours, sticking to familiar routes, avoiding the more dangerous areas where other homeless people had claimed territory. Samuel had learned early on that the streets operated by their own set of rules, and stepping into the wrong alley could mean trouble. But today, something felt off. The usual flow of people and traffic seemed thinner, and there was an unusual number of police cars patrolling the streets. As they passed by a convenience store, Samuel noticed a crowd gathered near the entrance, their voices hushed and tense. He caught snippets of conversation as they walked by. "Another break-in last night. Armed robbery, I heard. Rich neighborhoods are getting hit hard." Samuel quickened his pace, pulling Shadow along with him. He didn't like the sound of this. The last thing he needed was to get caught up in some kind of trouble. The wealthy parts of the city had always been off-limits for him. He knew better than to linger there. The police were quicker to respond, and the residents were far less tolerant of people like him. But Shadow seemed to sense something, pulling against the leash, his nose in the air as if catching a scent on the breeze. Samuel frowned, tugging him gently. "Come on, Shadow. We don't need to be here." Just as they were about to turn the corner, a black SUV pulled up in front of them, cutting off their path. Samuel froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The windows of the vehicle were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then the back window rolled down slowly. A man in a sleek black suit leaned out, his sharp eyes locking onto Samuel. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unnerving in the way he stared, as if sizing Samuel up. Shadow growled softly, his fur bristling. "You Samuel Johnson?" the man asked, his voice smooth and controlled. Samuel swallowed hard, unsure whether to lie or tell the truth. He had no idea who this man was or why he was looking for him, but nothing about the situation felt right. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on Shadow's leash, ready to run if necessary. "Who's asking?" Samuel replied cautiously. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Relax. We're not here to cause trouble. In fact, we're here to offer you a job." Samuel blinked, taken aback. A job? From a man in a black Mercedes. Nothing about this made sense. "What kind of job?" he asked warily. The man glanced down at Shadow, then back at Samuel. "A simple one. We need someone who can keep an eye on things, someone who knows the streets, who can blend in without attracting too much attention. And we hear you're good at that." Samuel's mind raced. He didn't trust this man, not for a second. But the offer of a job, no matter how suspicious, was tempting. It had been years since anyone had offered him anything other than a few spare coins or a pitying glance. He could feel Shadow's tension beside him, the dog's body coiled and ready to protect him at a moment's notice. "I'm not interested," Samuel said, his voice firm. The man's smile faded slightly. "Think it over, Samuel. We know where to find you." With that, the window rolled up, and the SUV drove away, disappearing into the morning traffic. Samuel stood there for a long moment, his heart still pounding. What had just happened? Who were those people, and why were they interested in him? He had spent years trying to stay invisible, to keep his head down and avoid trouble. Now, out of nowhere, a stranger had approached him with an offer that smelled of danger. He glanced down at Shadow, who was watching him intently, his ears perked up as if waiting for Samuel to make the next move. "Let's get out of here," Samuel muttered, turning on his heel and walking briskly in the opposite direction. He didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't going to stick around to find out. As they walked, Samuel's mind churned with questions. The unease that had been building all morning now settled deep in his gut. Something was happening in the city, something big, and he had a sinking feeling that he was about to be dragged into it, whether he wanted to be or not. For the rest of the day, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every time he turned a corner, he half expected to see the black SUV idling nearby, its mysterious occupants watching his every move. Shadow stayed close to his side, his ears twitching as if he too sensed the tension in the air. As evening approached, Samuel made his way back to his tent, feeling more exhausted than usual. He and Shadow had managed to scavenge enough food to get by, but the encounter with the man in the black SUV had left him rattled. He sank down onto his sleeping bag, running a hand over his face. What was he going to do? He couldn't just ignore what had happened, but he didn't have the luxury of getting involved in other people's problems. He had enough of his own to deal with. Shadow curled up beside him, resting his head on Samuel's leg. The simple gesture of companionship brought a small measure of comfort, but it did little to ease the growing unease in Samuel's mind. As the city settled into the stillness of night, Samuel lay awake, staring up at the stars through the thin fabric of his tent. He had survived on these streets for years, but something told him that the days ahead were going to be different. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't be facing it alone. He had Shadow by his side now, and that was enough. For the first time in years, Samuel closed his eyes and allowed himself to hope, just a little, that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. The next part will delve deeper into the mysterious offer and Samuel's decision, exploring the tension between his instincts for self-preservation and the pull of a new dangerous opportunity. Unseen forces. The city was shrouded in mist the next morning. A dense, lingering fog that wrapped itself around the skyscrapers and wove through the alleyways like a ghost. Samuel's breath came out in soft plumes as he sat on the cold ground, his back against the cracked brick wall of the old building that had become their home for the night. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Samuel's leg, his eyes closed but ears twitching, ever alert. The eerie quiet made the city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Samuel had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. The black SUV, the man's offer, the unsettling way he had known Samuel's name and history, despite his years of staying off the grid. Every instinct screamed that this was bad news, but there was a part of him, a dark, hungry part, that was tempted. How long had it been since anyone had seen him as useful? He tried to push the thoughts away, but they stuck, like burrs clinging to his skin. He couldn't afford to get involved with whatever shady business that man was offering, not when the streets already held more danger than he could handle. But his gut told him this wouldn't be the last he'd see of them. Shadow's soft growl broke through his thoughts. The dog's eyes were open now, focused on the alleyway ahead. "Someone's coming," Samuel whispered, his hand instinctively tightening around the leash. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls of the narrow alley. Samuel pressed himself against the wall, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't see through the fog, but he knew the rhythm of those steps, too careful, too measured. Whoever was approaching wasn't just some random passerby. A figure emerged from the mist, dressed in a long, dark coat, the collar pulled up to shield against the cold. It was a woman, though her face was obscured by the hood of her coat. Her hands were tucked in her pockets, but something about the way she moved told Samuel she wasn't just wandering the streets. "Samuel Johnson?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Twice in 2 days. Whoever these people were, they had eyes everywhere. He stood up slowly, his body tense. Shadow let out another growl, but Samuel placed a calming hand on his head. "Who are you?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice even. "What do you want?" The woman pulled back her hood, revealing sharp features and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to cut through the fog like knives. Her hair was cropped short, and there was a cold efficiency to the way she carried herself. She wasn't here to negotiate or make small talk. She was here on business. "I'm here to deliver a message," she said, stepping closer. Samuel could see now that her coat wasn't just for warmth. It was tactical, designed to hide weapons or tools. This was no ordinary visitor. "You should have taken the offer," she continued, her gaze unflinching. "The people I work for don't like being ignored." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. He had been right to trust his instincts. This wasn't just some random job offer. These people were dangerous, and now they knew where to find him. But why? Why him, of all people? He had nothing to offer, no value. He was just a man trying to survive one day at a time. "I don't want any trouble," Samuel said, his voice firm but edged with uncertainty. "I'm just trying to get by." The woman smirked, a cold, humorless expression. "Trouble's already found you, Samuel. The question is whether you're smart enough to deal with it." Before Samuel could respond, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small black envelope. She held it out to him, her eyes narrowing. "Take it." Samuel hesitated, eyeing the envelope as if it might explode in his hands. Shadow let out a soft whine, sensing his master's unease. "What is this?" Samuel asked, not reaching for it. "Instructions," she said simply. "You're being given a second chance. Don't waste it." Samuel reluctantly took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the cool, slick surface. It felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it should have. The woman stepped back into the fog, her form fading into the mist as quickly as she had appeared. "Wait," Samuel called after her, his voice catching in his throat. "Who are you people?" Her voice drifted back, haunting and detached. "We're the ones who see what others don't, and we've been watching you for a long time." Samuel stood frozen in place, the envelope clutched in his hand, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about a job. It was about something deeper, something he didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. He had been dragged into a game far beyond his control. Shadow nuzzled his leg, pulling Samuel out of his thoughts. He looked down at the dog, whose brown eyes were filled with trust and loyalty. For the first time in years, Samuel had someone who relied on him, someone who gave his life purpose again. But was he putting Shadow in danger by staying, by running? He couldn't run, not anymore. With trembling hands, Samuel opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of black paper, glossy and embossed with silver lettering that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The message was short, but the words sent a fresh wave of unease washing over him. "Meet at 9th and Jefferson. Midnight. Alone." There was no name, no signature, just an address and a time. Samuel swallowed hard. He had been to 9th and Jefferson before. It was deep in the industrial district, a place long abandoned by the city. Factories that had shut down years ago. Now nothing but empty shells filled with rust and decay. If there was any place in the city that would swallow a man whole and never spit him out, it was there. "What do you think, Toy?" Samuel asked quietly, looking down at Shadow. The dog looked up at him, his tail thumping lightly against the ground as if to say, "I trust you." But Samuel didn't trust himself. Hours passed as he wrestled with his decision, pacing back and forth in their makeshift shelter. He knew he couldn't ignore this. If he didn't show up, they'd come looking for him again. And next time, they might not send someone as civil as the woman in the coat, but showing up. That felt like walking straight into the lion's den. He was no stranger to dangerous situations. The streets had taught him that survival often meant taking risks, making split-second decisions between life and death. But this was different. This wasn't a fight for scraps or a night spent dodging drunken fists in a shelter. This was something much darker. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Samuel made his choice. He packed up what little he had, slipping the black envelope into his pocket. Shadow, sensing the shift in mood, stood up, his body tense and ready. "You stay close tonight," Samuel murmured as they stepped into the night. "I don't know what we're walking into." The walk to 9th and Jefferson was long, and with each step, Samuel's sense of foreboding grew. The fog had lifted slightly, but the city seemed eerily quiet, as if it too knew that something was about to happen. As they neared the industrial district, the familiar hum of the city gave way to a haunting stillness. The streets were lined with crumbling factories, their windows shattered, their walls covered in faded graffiti. Samuel approached the intersection cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Midnight was still an hour away, but the streets were already empty, as if the entire area had been abandoned long before. He found a spot against a wall where he could keep his back covered and waited, Shadow sitting obediently at his side. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging on longer than the last. Samuel's nerves were frayed, his mind racing with possibilities. What if this was a setup? What if they planned to kill him, leave his body in some forgotten alley? He clenched his fists, forcing the fear down. At exactly midnight, a car's engine rumbled in the distance. The sound grew louder, cutting through the stillness. Samuel straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. A sleek black sedan rolled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The door opened, and the same man from the SUV stepped out, his face bathed in the harsh glow of the street lamp. "Glad you decided to show," the man said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Samuel didn't respond. He was done talking. Now, it was time to find out what the hell was going on. into the lion's den. The black sedan's engine hummed in the cold night air as the man from the SUV stood there, watching Samuel with a chilling calm. He was dressed the same, sharp, unassuming, and utterly cold. His eyes, however, carried an unsettling weight. They seemed to strip away layers, searching for weakness, doubt, fear. Samuel stood his ground, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Shadow growled low beside him, the dog's instincts kicking in. But Samuel kept a steady hand on his companion's neck, silently reassuring him. The night air hung heavy between them, and for a moment it seemed like neither man would break the silence. "You're late," the man said, his voice smooth, as though Samuel were arriving for a business meeting rather than some cryptic midnight rendezvous. "I was beginning to wonder if you had changed your mind." Samuel's jaw tightened. The envelope in his pocket felt like a weight pulling him deeper into whatever abyss he'd stumbled into. "I didn't have much of a choice," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Straight to business, then." "I appreciate that, Samuel. But first," his eyes flickered to Shadow, standing protectively at Samuel's side. "The dog stays here." Samuel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Shadow was his lifeline, his partner, and there was no way he was leaving him behind. "No, he comes with me." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being disobeyed. A tense pause followed before he gave a small, indifferent shrug. "Suit yourself. Just know that your choices from here on out will carry consequences." Samuel didn't flinch. He knew this already. Every choice had a cost. He'd been paying for his whole life. With a curt nod, the man turned and gestured toward the back seat of the sedan. "Get in." Shadow growled again, and for a moment, Samuel considered bolting. But he knew that running would only delay the inevitable. Whoever these people were, they'd made it clear they weren't the kind to let things go. Samuel took a deep breath, giving Shadow a firm pat on the head before stepping forward. The dog followed, his eyes never leaving the stranger as they climbed into the back of the car. The sedan's interior was sleek, polished leather, the kind of luxury that seemed out of place in the decaying industrial district. The door closed with a solid thud, and as soon as it did, Samuel felt the subtle shift, the quiet sealing of a deal. The man slid into the driver's seat, glanced at Samuel through the rearview mirror, and pulled away from the curb. The city lights blurred by as they sped through streets Samuel hadn't been down in years. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. Shadow rested his head on Samuel's lap, his body tense but trusting. Samuel's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Why him? What could they possibly want with someone like him? Someone the world had long since forgotten. He'd lived in the shadows, blending into the cracks of the city, surviving off scraps. There was nothing special about him, nothing that made him valuable. Yet here he was, being driven through the city in a car that probably cost more than he'd earned in a decade. They left the city behind, the streetlights fading as they entered a stretch of dark highway. The road was flanked by dense trees, their shadows stretching long and eerie in the headlights. Samuel's stomach tightened as the realization sank in. Wherever they were going, it wasn't a place he could easily walk away from. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowed, pulling off the main road onto a narrow, unmarked path. The trees pressed in on either side, and the air grew colder. Samuel's hand tightened around Shadow's fur as they wound deeper into the woods. Eventually, the car came to a stop in front of a large wrought iron gate. Beyond it, Samuel could make out the silhouette of a sprawling estate, its windows dark, and its structure looming like a predator waiting in the dark. The gate opened with a low creak, and the sedan rolled forward, following the gravel path up to the mansion. The estate was massive, far larger than anything Samuel had ever seen. The stone facade was cold and imposing, the kind of building that seemed designed to intimidate. As the car came to a stop, the man got out, opening the door for Samuel. "We're here." Samuel stepped out cautiously, his eyes scanning the grounds. The place was eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. Shadow stayed close, his fur bristling as they approached the front doors. The man led them inside, where the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and old money. A grand staircase dominated the foyer, and the walls were lined with portraits, men and women, all wearing the same cold, calculating expressions. "This way," the man instructed, his voice echoing in the vast space as they moved deeper into the mansion. They passed through long corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick, ornate rugs. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Samuel felt a growing sense of unease. Every instinct told him he was walking into a trap, but it was too late to turn back now. Finally, they reached a set of double doors at the end of a long hallway. The man stopped in front of them, placing his hand on the handle but not opening it just yet. "Inside, you'll meet someone very important," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "You'll listen carefully to what they say, and you'll follow their instructions. Failure to do so will not be tolerated." Samuel nodded, his jaw clenched. He had no idea what awaited him on the other side of those doors, but he knew one thing. He was in deep. Too deep to back out now. The man pushed open the doors, revealing a large room dimly lit by a roaring fireplace. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books and strange artifacts Samuel couldn't place. In the center of the room, seated in a high-backed chair, was an older man, his silver hair slicked back and his eyes sharp behind thin glasses. He was dressed in a tailored suit, and though his body was frail with age, there was a commanding presence about him, as if the room itself bent to his will. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, his voice smooth and measured, "I've been expecting you." Samuel stepped forward, the doors closing behind him with a quiet thud. Shadow stayed close, his eyes locked on the older man. The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. The older man studied Samuel for a long moment before speaking again. "You've lived in the shadows for a long time, haven't you? A man who knows how to survive when the world turns its back on him. Impressive, really." Samuel didn't respond, his mind racing. This man wasn't here to compliment him. There was an edge to his words, a hidden threat lurking beneath the surface. "I imagine you're wondering why you're here," the man continued, his eyes never leaving Samuel's. "Why someone like you would be of interest to someone like me." "Yeah," Samuel said, his voice low. "That's crossed my mind." The man smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been chosen, Mr. Johnson. Chosen for something far greater than you can imagine." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. Chosen for what? The man leaned forward, his gaze intense. "To join us. To be part of something bigger. You have skills we need, and whether you realize it or not, the world is on the brink of something monumental. And people like you, those who have learned to navigate the darkness, will play a crucial role in what's to come." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just some job offer. This was something far more sinister. But before he could respond, the man stood, walking slowly toward him. "You'll have time to understand the details," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But for now, you'll follow the path we set before you. And in return, you'll be given everything you've been denied for so long." He stopped in front of Samuel, his eyes piercing. Power, purpose, control. Samuel swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the air thick with tension. He didn't want power or control. He wanted to survive, to live. But it was clear that this man wasn't offering him a choice. "You either embrace what's coming," the man said, his voice now a soft growl, "or you'll be swept away by it." Samuel's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced down at Shadow, who looked up at him with trust in his eyes. The dog had followed him into hell and back. Could he do the same? Before he could answer, the man smiled again. "Good. I see you understand." With a final glance, the man turned and walked back to his chair, the fire casting long shadows across the room. Welcome to the future, Samuel. You've just taken your first step into a world you'll never leave. The weight of those words settled deep in Samuel's chest. He had been drawn into something far bigger than himself, something he couldn't escape. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel wasn't sure he wanted to. Unseen chains. The air in the mansion was stifling. Samuel could feel the weight of unseen eyes as he stood in the grand room, the fire crackling ominously behind him. The older man, seated now like a judge at the head of some twisted court, watched Samuel with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had already won. "Take a seat," the man said softly, gesturing toward a leather chair across from him. His tone carried an expectation that it would be obeyed. Samuel hesitated. Everything in him screamed to walk out. No, run, but something darker than fear kept him rooted in place. Shadow pressed against his leg, the dog's muscles coiled with tension, but loyal as ever. With a slow exhale, Samuel moved toward the chair and sat down, his body stiff with unease. The older man steepled his fingers, watching Samuel with a piercing gaze that seemed to burrow beneath his skin. "Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Johnson. You're not a prisoner here. Not yet. But the world outside these walls is not the world you remember. Not anymore." Samuel's eyes narrowed. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The man leaned back in his chair, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, creating the illusion of something almost demonic in the shifting shadows. "It means you're not in control, Samuel. Not out there. Not in here." He let the silence hang between them for a beat, letting the words sink in like poison. "You see, we've been watching you for some time now." Samuel's stomach twisted. "Watching me? Your life," the man continued, ignoring Samuel's question, "has been a series of missed opportunities, unfortunate circumstances, and choices forced upon you. You've wandered through the cracks of society, clinging to survival. But you've always known that survival isn't enough, haven't you?" Samuel's hands tightened into fists on his lap. "Get to the point." The man's lips curled into that thin, serpentine smile again. "We've given you a choice, Mr. Johnson. And make no mistake, it is a choice, though not one without consequences. You can walk away, right now, if you'd like." He gestured vaguely toward the door, though Samuel could sense the emptiness of the offer. "Or you can stay and be part of something that will change the world. No more scrambling in the shadows. No more scraping by. Power, influence, security." Samuel's heart pounded as the words swirled around him. Power, influence, security. Things he had once dreamed of, but had long since learned to live without. The older man's offer sounded seductive, like a lifeline being thrown to someone drowning in the murk of his past. But there was something off about it, something far too clean, too rehearsed. "What exactly do you want from me?" Samuel asked, his voice low, steady. He wasn't buying into this without knowing the cost. The man's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I need someone who can operate in the shadows, someone with the skills to move undetected, to see the things others don't, to disappear when necessary. You've done it before, Samuel. You've survived in ways most men can't even comprehend." Samuel's throat tightened. It was true. He'd learned how to disappear, how to live a life so far on the fringes that no one noticed him. He had no family left, no ties. And after everything he'd been through, what did he really have to lose? "I've got nothing to offer you," Samuel said, shaking his head. "If you've been watching me, you already know that." The older man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You underestimate yourself. You see, it's not about what you have now. It's about what you can become. With us." The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the room as the man continued, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I won't lie to you, Samuel. The path ahead is dangerous. But you've been walking a dangerous path your whole life. The difference is, with us, you won't be alone. You'll have the backing of an organization that operates far beyond the reach of ordinary men. We're offering you a way out of the shadows, a way to be more than just another lost soul scraping by." Samuel sat in silence, his mind racing. He had spent years in isolation, in survival mode, never imagining that anyone would come offering him an alternative. But now that it was here, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no gift. There were strings attached, chains, even just as invisible and unbreakable as the ones he'd spent his life trying to escape. "And if I say no?" Samuel finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's expression hardened slightly, his smile disappearing entirely. "If you say no, you go back to your old life. But don't be naive. The world has changed, Samuel. The people you've crossed, the ones who are looking for you, they'll find you eventually. And when they do—" He paused, his voice cold as ice. "Let's just say they won't be as forgiving as we are." Samuel felt the weight of the threat, unspoken yet unmistakable. He was backed into a corner, just like always. Only this time, the stakes were higher, much higher. The older man stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in his suit before walking toward a cabinet on the far side of the room. He opened it, revealing a set of old, worn books and strange artifacts. His fingers traced one of the spines, as if deciding whether to pull it out. "There are forces at play here that you can't begin to understand, Samuel. But I don't need you to understand them. Not yet. I just need you to trust that we are your best option." Samuel stared at the man's back, feeling the creeping sense that he was being pulled into something ancient, something far older and far more dangerous than he could comprehend. It wasn't just about crime or corruption. There was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface of this invitation. "Why me?" Samuel asked again, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Out of all the people you could have chosen, why me?" The older man turned slowly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Because, Mr. Johnson, you have something most men lack. You've spent your entire life surviving. But you've also never truly belonged. You've never had anyone to fight for, no real purpose. You're a blank slate, Samuel. And that's exactly what we need. A man without ties, without limits." A chill ran down Samuel's spine. The man was right. He didn't belong anywhere. He had no family, no home. But the thought of being molded into something dangerous, something that served someone else's agenda, made his skin crawl. The older man moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We're not asking you to become something you're not. We're offering you a chance to be what you've always been, but with purpose, with power." Samuel's pulse quickened as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. This wasn't a simple job offer. This was an invitation to step into a world where the rules were different, where men like him weren't just pawns, but weapons. But at what cost? Before Samuel could respond, the older man extended a hand, his eyes locking onto Samuel's with unnerving intensity. "What do you say, Samuel? Will you join us, or will you walk back into the darkness alone?" Samuel stared at the outstretched hand, his mind swirling with doubts, questions, and fear. There was no good answer, no clear path forward, only a choice between two versions of hell, one known, one unknown. But as the flames flickered behind him and the mansion's walls seemed to close in, Samuel realized one thing. The shadows, the dark corners of his life where he had hidden for so long, they were already suffocating him. With a deep breath, Samuel reached out, clasping the older man's hand in his. The deal was sealed. "Welcome," the older man whispered, his smile returning as he gripped Samuel's hand with surprising strength. "Welcome to the beginning of your new life." And just like that, Samuel knew there was no turning back. Beneath the surface, the handshake lingered for a moment too long. The older man's grip was firm, almost too tight, as if sealing something deeper than a mere agreement. Samuel could feel the weight of it, a decision that couldn't be undone, a path from which there was no return. As he pulled his hand away, he felt the air in the room shift, colder, heavier. He glanced at Shadow, who had remained unnaturally still by his side. The dog's eyes flickered with a strange awareness, like it, too, understood the gravity of the choice just made. The older man straightened his jacket, his expression a mask of calm satisfaction. "Very well," he said smoothly, moving back toward the fire as if the conversation had concluded. "There's much to be done, and little time to waste. You'll be briefed in due course, of course, but for now, I suggest you rest." Rest. The word sounded hollow, absurd. Samuel's mind was racing, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He had just signed up for something he didn't understand. The man's cryptic words, the talk of unseen forces and ancient power. It was all too much. He had spent his life surviving on instinct, reading people, and this man was no ordinary predator. He was something more, something far older than the world Samuel had known. "What exactly is it that I'm involved in now?" Samuel's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. He stood up, unable to sit still any longer, his muscles coiled with restless energy. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to leave without them. The older man didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire, the flames casting his face in sharp relief. For a moment, he looked ancient, like a figure pulled from the pages of history, a king in some forgotten dynasty. "You're involved in survival," he said softly, almost too softly for Samuel to hear. "But not just your own." The word sent a chill down Samuel's spine. He swallowed hard, trying to process the implications. "What do you mean?" The man finally turned, his eyes gleaming with something that could have been either excitement or something far more dangerous. "There are forces in this world, Samuel, that the average man has no concept of. Forces that shape nations, that decide who rises and who falls. Governments, corporations, secret societies. They're all just pieces on a much larger board. He paused, gesturing to the grand room around them, as though it was the tip of an iceberg, are playing a different game altogether. A game that spans centuries. A game where the stakes are far beyond money, or power, or even survival as you know it." Samuel felt his stomach knot. He had seen enough in his life to know when someone was lying to him. But this man wasn't lying. He was telling the truth, or at least a version of it that Samuel had never heard before, and that made it all the more terrifying. "I didn't sign up for this. Whatever this is," Samuel muttered, his mind spinning. "Oh, but you did," the man said, stepping closer, his voice low, almost a whisper now. "You've been signing up for it your whole life, whether you realized it or not. Every choice, every move you made brought you here. You didn't stumble into this by accident, Samuel. You were meant to be here. You were chosen." Chosen? Samuel's throat tightened. He had heard that word before, when he was younger, when people thought he had potential. But it had always turned out to be hollow promises, false hopes. This time, though, the weight behind the word was different, heavier. "Yes, chosen," the older man repeated. "There are not many people who can do what you do, who can see the world the way you do. You've been hiding in the shadows for so long that you've forgotten what it's like to step into the light. But we haven't forgotten. We've been waiting for someone like you." Samuel felt the walls closing in again. His head was spinning, his chest tight. The weight of this new reality was crushing him. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice strained. "What do you want from me? What's the next move?" The man smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Now we prepare. Your training begins. You'll be given the tools you need to survive in this new world. But make no mistake, Samuel, this isn't about just surviving anymore. This is about thriving. This is about power." Samuel's gut twisted at the word. Power. It was something he had never sought, something that had never interested him. Survival had been enough. Keeping his head down, staying off the radar, that had been his life. But now the rules had changed. Power for what? Samuel asked, his voice tight. "You keep talking in circles. What do you really want from me?" The older man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You'll understand soon enough. But for now, all you need to know is that the world is changing, rapidly, and those who don't adapt will be left behind." The fire crackled louder, as though it were echoing the man's words. Samuel stared into the flames, feeling the heat prickling his skin. He had lived through change before, had adapted, had survived. But this was something different. This was a world he didn't understand, a world where the rules were written by people like this man. And yet, despite the fear curling in his gut, Samuel couldn't deny the spark of curiosity flickering in his mind. What if this man was right? What if this was his chance to finally do more than just scrape by? What if, for the first time in his life, he could be in control? The older man moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. "Come. There's something I need to show you before we begin." Samuel hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Shadow, who had risen to his feet, alert. The dog's dark eyes met Samuel's, as if waiting for his signal. With a deep breath, Samuel followed the older man, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. They walked down a narrow corridor, the walls lined with old portraits and strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy Samuel couldn't quite explain. The mansion was larger than it had appeared from the outside, its hallways twisting and turning like a labyrinth. Samuel felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the kind of history that wasn't written in textbooks, but in blood and secrets. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hall. The older man stopped in front of it, placing his hand on the polished wood. He turned to Samuel, his expression unreadable. "Once you step through this door, there's no going back. You'll see things that can't be unseen. You'll know truths that can't be forgotten." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He had a choice. He could walk away now, leave this place behind, and go back to his old life, whatever that meant. But something deep inside him, a voice he had long ignored, whispered that there was no going back. Not really. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had been through. He was already in too deep. With a slow nod, Samuel stepped forward. The older man pushed open the door, and as it creaked on its hinges, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Beyond the door lay a room unlike anything he had ever seen, a cavernous chamber lit by the eerie glow of strange, floating orbs. In the center of the room stood a massive stone table, etched with symbols that pulsed with a faint otherworldly light. Around the table stood figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured, their presence radiating power. "This," the older man said, his voice reverberating through the chamber, "is where it begins." Samuel stepped inside, the weight of unseen forces pressing down on him as he crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, sealing his fate. And in that moment, Samuel knew he had just entered a world far darker, far more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined.